The last segment is very simple, and it's intended to talk about what we're going to do tomorrow, and then afterwards we'll have the reception. If we can have the timeline displayed on the screen. Very quickly, we are here in the middle. We're in Canada. Paris produced areas for cooperation, which were a list of elements that helped structure the work between Paris and Ottawa. The multi-stakeholder contact groups that I've mentioned before worked during all that period. Many conference calls, a certain number of people in this room have actually participated in those groups. The end result was the documents that you have in the workbook, the policy option documents. As I said before, they're not perfect. They're the best effort of mapping the situation of the discussion at the moment. What we hope to do tomorrow is in the same workbook, you have another thing, which is a one-pager called work plan. It contains 3 elements. The first element is a quick recap of why we need to address those issues, and the moderators will mention them. The second idea and the second block is an attempt, a draft, an attempt at providing a formulation of a common objective that the different actors can share. I've used with a certain number of you in private conference calls or discussions the metaphor that in Paris we began to see a sort of path forward, that it looked like people were willing to work together and they identified areas for cooperation. What we're trying to do in Canada is the equivalent of arriving in a forest and you get in a clearing and suddenly you see the mountain in the distance and you know that's where you want to go. And we want to try to have a formulation that is concise, that people can agree upon. And when we had the moderation breakfast this morning, Wolfgang Schulz said something that I need to integrate in this metaphor, which is that maybe it's not so much a mountain itself, because the mountain is fixed and it's rigid. We need to invent something. So maybe what we're trying to do is to identify what is the path we want to take. And as we said before, what is the digital society we want to build? But the idea of Ottawa is not to reopen the framing of the problem. We've done that. We all know there are problems. It's not either to try to wordsmith the policy options documents. They're just an input document. The main objective is to agree, among other things, in the third part of the work plans, which is a list of one-liners. And those one-liners actually are abstracted from the policy options document. They're basically the headlines. They're as neutral as possible. And the purpose is first to use this for the work that will take place between Ottawa and Berlin, where working groups, and we'll explain more in Wednesday, how the work is going to be conducted. But the goal is to say, these are the skeleton of frameworks, of regimes. These are the components that will be filled. Think of them as cursors. What we need to agree on here is how many cursors we need to define regimes or to analyze regimes. How many components need to be put in place? And the work afterwards will be, where do we put the cursor? And it doesn't mean that the cursor will be in one specific position. In each line, it might be a range. But what we need to agree upon here is to have a list of a common set of topics. And in the preparation this morning, there was also something that emerged, which is not only is this intended to structure the work between Ottawa and Berlin for the Internet and Jurisdiction Secretariat to facilitate, it is also potentially useful for every developer of a solution to look at the list and say, what is my response to those criteria? Have I ticked the boxes? Have I responded to this element? It's also an instrument for people to discuss among themselves about solutions proposed by other people or when they coordinate. But what we realized this morning is, in addition, all of you have very strongly argumented positions, and it's the role that you have in your daily lives. This conference is not the moment where we will finalize solutions. As I said to a few people, if, by the way, tomorrow, some of you in one of the tracks come up with illumination and you have the final and the ultimate solution, please don't hesitate. I mean, share. But in case this does not happen, the purpose is to make sure that all of your concerns that you will have the opportunity to express, they may not be resolved, but you want to make sure that there is one line that is a hook to make sure that in the work afterwards, your preoccupations will find a slot. And if you feel that there's something that is missing, please add it. But I have a big request to make. Please, in this work, understand that this is not about negotiating a treaty that will have binding obligations. This is just a tool that you will be using and we will be using next year. So the more you can agree on the formulation, even if it's a rough formulation sometimes, and the more time you will be able to use for discussing the substance. With that, I want to introduce the three moderators for each of the tracks. And if I find the page, of course. Yes. There's no particular order, but I can start with Martin Botterman, who is currently a member, we will be moderating, sorry, the domains work stream. He's currently on the ICANN board. He was previously the chair of the PIR board, which is the operator that manages the .org. And interestingly enough, he was also previously with the European Commission as a scientific officer, which is an interesting title. And he has worked at RAND Corporation also before. I may continue with Wolfgang Schulz, who is in the middle of the row here. We will be moderating the content track. He's a director for two research centers in Germany, the Hans Bredow Institute and the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. He was also, for those of you who have followed this work, the chair of a group that Thomas Schneider and I and a few others have been participating in the Council of Europe called MSINet, which has currently a recommendation going through the hoops of approval in the Council of Europe on the role and responsibilities of intermediaries. And he is also the UNESCO chair on freedom of communication and information. And finally, Peter SWIRE, here on the left, will be moderating the track on data. And he is a professor at Georgia Tech, teaching basically issues regarding privacy and cybersecurity. He has been working in different positions in the White House in the US as a privacy counselor, as an advisor on economy issues, and he was also one of the 5 people in the team that was set up under the Obama administration to produce the so-called NSA analysis and report after the Snowden revelations. And he has been extremely active since 2013 on the whole question of data access and cross-border cooperation in that regard. So these are the people who will be tasked with driving you in there, and maybe I will ask them to say a few words regarding each of the tracks, so that we're in line regarding, in particular, the methodology and the first elements of the objectives and the reason why we do. Can we start this way? Martin, please go. Aha, convergence of two things.
This works better. Yeah. So the domain track is really about the domain name system, which is basically identifiers and not so much to do with content. At the same time, the industry sees it's confronted with more and more requests for takedowns across borders, whatever, and it's affects the customers of the industry. So it's relevant, and we've had very lively and interesting discussions in Paris and subsequently in webinars. So from all these discussions, the following text is what the Secretariat concluded from where we are today. And this is the input, the starting point of the session. It's cross-border requests for domain name suspensions are increasingly sent to technical operators in relation to the alleged abuse of content or activity on underlying websites. Yet the DNS as an addressing system is a neutral technical layer vital for the proper functioning of the internet. This level is neither a fully effective way, nor should be considered as a natural tool to address abusive content. Yet acting at the DNS level should only be considered when it can be reliably determined that the domain itself is registered with a clear intent of significant abusive conduct. Furthermore, because of domain suspension has by definition a global impact, proportionality imposes that only a particularly high level of abuse and or harm could potentially justify resorting to such a measure. This important issue is generally recognized as outside of ICANN's mandate. Moreover, the fundamental distinctions between country code and generic top-level domains, so the .com, the .org, etc. In terms, ICANN and national laws and authorities lead a very different approach and constraints towards those different domains. All actors are nonetheless confronted with that common challenge, defining when it's appropriate to act at the DNS level in relation to the content of a site and what role courts and so-called notifiers should or could respectively play. And that's the focus of the discussion tomorrow.
And this is, of course, in the workbook. I take the transition to highlight that it is very important that for each of the work streams that you participate in, you take the time, at least tonight, if you haven't done so, to read the very limited number of pages. It's usually 5 to 6, including the work plan, so that you have all the elements in your hand for tomorrow. Wolfgang.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for giving me this role. I hope that we'll have a great discussion tomorrow, and I'm sure we will have, since many things that have been said this afternoon relate to the content level, and so I think that will be a very good discussion tomorrow. Just very briefly where we start, I would use my own words here. I see Bertrand raising the eyebrows already because I have carefully drafted the text, and I'm sure you will all, when you go to the before you go to bed this evening, you will read page 20 of the working book that has been provided kindly by the Secretariat if you want to participate tomorrow in the content stream. So the argument in brief, first of all, we all know that millions of pieces of content are posted every day, which is extremely great for freedom of expression and access to information, of course, but also there are legitimate concerns in many aspects as regards harmful behavior, hate speech is a point, harassment, security threats, incitement to violence and discrimination that are mentioned here especially. The second aspect, when we want to tackle these issues and respect freedom of expression, we will soon detect that we will have jurisdiction issues. Content may be legal in one country and illegal in the other. We all know that. We know that there have to be made many decisions every day about possible restrictions, and we want them to be made in a specific quality. We want the context to be considered, for example. On the other hand, we know that we have a time issue. Someone said it's an hour when, I think it was you, before things go viral. So we have a tension here that we have to deal with. And the candidates we are looking at when we have this challenge are the intermediaries, the different types of intermediaries. We talked about that today already. What is their proper role? What kind of responsibilities do they have? And we agree, I think, that at least clear guidelines and due procedure mechanisms are needed as a common goal that we want to achieve. There is a list of objectives here. I will not read that, but I have made some notes this afternoon, and I see already that they are extremely helpful. When you just go through a case we had this afternoon and talking about a specific type of intermediary, to say what is the respective role in respect to this function, to this service. What is that? What is about proportionality? What is the due process that is here relevant? So there are many points, and what we should discuss tomorrow is whether they reflect all the things we want to discuss in the next couple of months until Berlin, when we come to operational solutions, or do we have to tweak it a little, or is there an additional point necessary that we have to put in? Final remark, we talked about having some tangible result here, because courts are waiting, regulators are waiting for us. And I think we should notice that many of the distinctions we make, many of the taxonomies we offer, can already be helpful for courts, for example. If I have a taxonomy of extraterritorial effects, for example, or if I have other taxonomies that can help balancing tests in a court, so that can already have an effect, and we should not only think in terms of coming up with a set of rules or a consistent framework. We can make a difference already before that. I'm convinced about that. And very last point, since Bertrand mentioned Immanuel Kant in the morning, there is a small piece of Kant on global freedom that is not so well known. And here, that's my interpretation, already says, don't wait for nation-state-like set of rules, but look for compatibility of the different rules, and keep in mind freedom of the individual and practical reasoning when you do that. And that's exactly the reciprocity tests and things like that Bertrand mentioned too. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm going to follow Michael Geist's example. He's a professor and I'm a professor, and we can't talk sitting down. So I'm going to briefly describe the data track, and then I'm going to make a request at the end to see if we can get some help for tomorrow. So this is the data track, and criminal investigations increasingly require access to information that's stored in the cloud, and it's often in a different country. In my own writing, I've called this the globalization of criminal evidence. We've had globalization of lots of other things. This is globalization of criminal evidence. In the old days, there was a crime in a city. It was a local investigation. Now there's a crime in the city. The data's overseas. So it's an international incident when somebody mugs somebody, and that's hard to handle for the police force. The existing way to handle this is mutual legal assistance treaties, but those are slow and not suited to the scale that we're facing now. Another approach is to go directly to the companies and say, give us the data. There's often few procedural protections around that, and it often doesn't work because of national blocking statutes. So with this current area of limited protections, legal uncertainty, blocking statutes, a lot of people think this isn't sustainable. And in particular, if we don't get cooperation between countries, we could see the spread of data localization, where every country will have the data locally so the police can get it locally. That will be enormously tempting. And there's a lot of problems with localization. So there's different efforts underway. The US has a Cloud Act proposal, and the European Union has a directive moving forward. These have happened since Paris in 2016. More will be happening soon. And so we need policy coherence. We need to talk about how to move to the new international system here. So roughly speaking, the challenges are to have respect for privacy, so the data is not just handed over to governments, respect for due process, and legitimate law enforcement requests being given credence. And how to do that is what we're going to work on tomorrow. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much to you all. Final points, and we can put an end to this very intense and useful day. I want to emphasize the following. Please. Oh yeah, you forgot the request.
This is very practical.
And by the way, so Wolfgang forgot to say there's an exam to get into his thing in the morning. If you don't answer correctly the questions about the work plan and so on, you cannot get in. So,
and I know how to get a big class. There's no exam in my class. So tomorrow, just amazingly, there's a Supreme Court argument in the United States, Microsoft versus Ireland. When Bertrand set this up however many months ago, who knew that the biggest cross-border case in history would happen on the day we're discussing cross-border here? So here's the request. The argument is going to be late morning. Is if there's anybody in your organization or someone you know who's going to be at the Supreme Court argument and could have a concise briefing back to us tomorrow, midday. Seriously. So there may well be in your company, in your organization, somebody who's on top of this. We would then get a debrief on Microsoft Ireland during the day. And so if you have a way to, what? NTIA. Well, whether they, getting government clearance on words. SCOTUS blog will give something, and that we may use that, but there may also be people who have it. So if you have some channel into that, we'd appreciate that tomorrow.
I think there is somebody from Microsoft here. So
I think they're all, there were 3 listed. I think they were busy tomorrow. Yeah.
All right. So final elements. We insist a lot on the neutrality of the Secretariat, and rightfully so. The moderators are extremely neutral, but I want to highlight also that the intention of the second day is to provide what we call a safe space. And what do I mean by safe space? It's a Chatham House rule environment, but more importantly, it is intended to allow people to explore what-ifs, to explore hypotheticals. What if we were developing this? Without the fear that most of us have when we are either in public or in international negotiations, where the moment you've mentioned one option, it's done, it's gone, it's there, it's on the table, and you cannot retract. So the goal is to provide a safe space where you can honestly and sincerely just say, well, I'm not necessarily sold on that idea, but if you were to do this, I would be willing to do that. And this is a very different approach from, as long as you don't do this, I will not do that, if you see what I mean. So the safe space is very important. The second element is, there is, you know, in mountain climbing, there's this notion of a ridge path where there's, you can fall on the left or fall on the right. This is the delicate path that and we are asking the moderators to help you take. There will be an extreme temptation to delve into the details, and it is important that you can exchange on the substance, because you're not coming here not to talk about the substance of those things. But at the same time, the main objective should remain also the production and the agreement on those 9, 10 components, because this is what is going to drive the work afterwards. So they have the delicate responsibility of combining both and actually reporting on the third day on both. So the more you, and the more quickly you agree on the list of things, the more you have time to discuss on the substance. And finally, a point, the expression has been used mentioning Berlin as the final conference. Unfortunately, I'm not absolutely sure that the topics regarding jurisdiction, even if we solve those 3, are going to be exhausted by Berlin. So Berlin is a milestone, is an objective for the tracks that we have, because we believe strongly that on the basis of where we are, there can be results. And the more we achieve in Berlin, the more it will be credible to tackle other issues. And believe me, or I believe you, there are others. With that, this is over. Thank you so much for all the contributions. It's a delight to be there. Thank you for your patience. And the doors are open, and the dinner, cocktail, things are available.